One of the most important lighting elements within Twinmotion, friends, is the HDR part. HDR actually means high-resolution files. However, since it contains the light source within itself, it actually changes the distribution of light in our environment for us, friends. Now, what is HDR? We will see how HDR affects. First, let me show you the use of HDR. Then, I will demonstrate with a professional explanation why HDR should be used and how it changes the ambience. Here, what you call sky includes the sky, indoor studio lights, and outdoor. When you place a vehicle in a studio environment, it's as if there are spotlights in the studio and an object in the middle. Think of it as a place where the object is illuminated by spotlights. When you say sky, look, 3 objects appear. Friends, it changes. As low sun intensity, medium, and high sun intensity. For example, partly cloudy. When we use an HDR object, the appearance of the object here will change, friends. For example, look, this is what I mentioned to you at the very beginning. The OK signs indicate that this HDR has not been downloaded. If I want to download the HDR, I press the download button on the HDR button here. This is downloading. If you don't want to search for this and want to use it later, this is a very important topic. Friends, press the heart button over there. The favorite section is on the main screen. I press behind the favor. Look, when I take this here and drag it into my scene, friends, this effect in my scene will become active here. So the effect in the external environment, the ambiance element, whether it will be closed, open, sunny, or partly sunny. I can change all of these. Look, it changed all of a sudden. And my setting here switched from dynamic sky to the HDR section because these are HDR files, friends. I want HDR files here with rotation. HDR files are high resolution and contain light. Photographs. Actually, they are 360-degree photographs. And look, there are many objects here. For example, let's download this, friends. I'm downloading it and pressing the heart button so I don't have to search for it later because there are so many HDRs. I'll show you how to find it in a moment when I press the heart button. Friends, after this is downloaded, when I drag it back into the scene, the ambiance here changes again. So what is the logic behind this? I want to show you the logic behind this. Okay, I placed these here. The sky changed. While changing the sky, the light falling on the materials also changed. Friends, the toning also changed. Look, there is a difference between this toning and the other toning. Let's do a rotation. Look, we are facing a more closed atmosphere, a softer atmosphere, a more realistic atmosphere. Did you see? But when I used the other HDR, it had a different ambiance. And that's why HDR changes the ambiance. Now, one of the famous sites is polyhaven.com, a site for HDR, and it's free. Friends, you can use and download these. Now, I want to show you the effect of HDR on the work in this way. Look, let's take a look at an example now. For example, I'm opening this image, friends. I opened this image. Look, here we have our HDR. In HDR, from the part that says 16K, these are the HDR files. By clicking download, you can use this HDR in Twinmotion if you want. In other words, you can also get HDR files from outside. When you use this file, it will be effective in your background. Friends, now, look, while doing these, there are spheres below in HDR. Did you see? Look, there are these spheres. It says when you use this HDR, your material will have this tone, and your plastic material will have this tone. Tone. Your metal material will have this tone, and your semi-gloss material will also have this tone. In other words, the HDR you use will change your ambience, weather conditions, and environmental elements. So, if the effect of the light is blue, it will be in blue tones. If it's soft, it will be in soft tones. And if it's gray, it will be in gray tones, as it is here. For example, let's come to this, for instance, a very dark blue. Look, when I select this, there will be such an effect in my scene. Using this effect is up to you, so don't get confused here. Which effect can I use? After creating the scene, you can drag and drop a few HDRs from here. You have the opportunity to use the HDR you want here. So, this is somewhat related to you, friends. It's related to the ambiance element you have chosen. Look, I took this and placed it here. The ambiance here will completely change. Did you see? It changed instantly. Look, the sun is here. If you want to move the sun to a different place, you can create a difference by rotating the rotation part here. Did you see? It's entirely an adjustment related to this, friends. Don't get confused. It's very simple. A very effective part that you do with the drag and drop method without making any other adjustments. Of course, I will come to these parts, but first we are trying to finish the left menu. After that, we will come to these parts and create more effective visuals here. While creating those visuals, of course, we will prepare the scene. We will use HDR in your scene. We will make a small mountain cabin, friends. A small mountain cabin with a lake in the middle, surrounded by fences, grass, trees, creating a small scene, and we will continue on that scene, friends. In the HDR section, look, there were many parts. Look, there were many parts here. Now, why did I click on the favorite section on the heart button? When you mark the heart button here, look, do you see? The heart icon I marked and used before is here. It becomes a favorite. When you take this and transfer it here, look, the HDRs I used previously and were active have come here, friends. When I came back, look, I came to the HDRs. I came to the HDRs, but the other HDRs are not visible. Why? Because the heart icon is active. I made it inactive. There are parts you will use indoors. Look, there are HDRs for indoor settings. Then there are landscape HDRs labeled as outdoor, which you will use more outside in exterior parts. Look, an HDR by the seaside, an HDR by the roadside. For example, let's use the one by the seaside. I'm clicking on it. I'm pressing on favorites so that I don't have to search for it later. When I let go of the product we downloaded, the active part will appear in the background along with the pairs. Friends, you know there are more here. Look, it says more start soldier. I close this eye. I close the eye. Look, now let this come. Let's drag and drop it. Maybe we'll need to remove this as well. Maybe to see the pairs clearly, friends, let's close it now and see. Because some items are quite large, they can load very slowly during the download. Because the normal size of one HDR is 300-400 MB, friends. So don't wonder why it's downloading slowly during the download, because these are large-scale files. Both downloading and placing it on the scene takes a certain amount of time. Look, there's such a situation in the background, as you can see. Again, from the rotation section, you can bring the background to the view you want. For example, let's say a view like this. As you can see, if we close this, we would see the HDR below. But the HDR's view is like this. But more than the view of the HDR, the light dynamics it provides us is important. As you can see, it gives us a toning like this. This toning shows that our work is quite realistic and high quality. Friends, that's it for HDRs. Here, you can download and drag HDRs onto the scene to experiment and test. On the right side, by playing with the rotation and intensity settings, you can create different ambiances. Friends, let's go to a completely overcast weather. Overcast weathers are actually nice. It looks gloomy like this, but it's really nice. Photos have been uploaded. Nice things have been done. See? Overcast, but light sunset is also overcast. It's overcast, but the sun is setting. It's exactly the period when there's a reddish hue. One of the very beautiful ambiances. Let's see, let's leave it here. What you need to do is take the HDR here, drop it here, and make your settings from the right side. Friends, very simple. Don't mess with the other settings for now. Just with the intensity and rotation settings of the HDR. For example, I can increase the effect of the HDR with the intensity here. Look, I increase the effect a lot. The ambiance is ruined. With rotation, I can change the position of the sun, as you can see, like this. It's such a thing. Generally, it's not recommended for the sun to come from the front. It's better if the sun comes from the right or the other side, meaning from the left or directly from behind. Because when we are in the role of the camera, it's more ideal for the sun to be behind us. This way, we can see the object more easily and have a clearer lighting opportunity. Friends,